Morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Morning.
I think it is up. All right, we'll do this. Better? All right. We got this. I think the agency theory is still viable. Let's begin with that proposition. I think we've got a lot of evidence that people are greedy and driven by self-interest. By the way, my boss would be very unhappy with me if I didn't say this. Idea is brought to you by the oldest law school in the United States, William & Mary Law School. Here's the question that I really want to ask, and that is just focusing on CEOs, and they're not the only people who have demonstrated greed and self-interest and misconduct, but why is it that so many CEOs go off the rails and destroy value and destroy companies and enrich themselves and shock us with their behavior? We would think, after so much scholarly work and communal normative building work, that this kind of behavior would not occur or would not occur as often as it does. And yet, it does. Here's a quiz. It's 9:05 in the morning. Here are just a few of the most recent members of the Rogues Gallery that represent really bad CEO behavior. In some cases criminal, in this case not. You recognize this guy? Call it out. Angelo Mozzillo, Countrywide Realty. Bad behavior. Richard Fuld, Lehman Brothers, down the drain, thousands of jobs lost, billions of dollars lost.
Lewis.
Ken Lewis of Bank America. Bad mistakes. John Corzine. This one may be harder to recognize. Anybody recognize this guy?
Chesapeake.
The guy from Chesapeake, Aubrey McClendon. His future is still in some question. He's been removed as CEO. He's been removed as director. There's still some interest in his behavior at Chesapeake. Raj Gupta, in jail for insider trading. These are very high-profile people. And my question is, why? Why do people at this elevated level find themselves going to jail or not going to jail, but disgraced, condemned, reviled? Why do we see so much of this behavior? And in the essay that I am preparing for the Wake Forest Law Review, I'm going to offer 4 possible explanations. And in doing so, I'm not going to talk about the high-profile people that we just identified, but some very low-profile people, picked more or less at random from newspapers and the SEC releases over the last 15 months. And I'm not going to spend much time this morning talking about who these folks are, but I'll just give you a peek. Exhibit 1, Mr. Wassendorf from Iowa, who over 20 years looted his company. It was a commodities trading company, and it represented the money of thousands of Midwestern farmers. And over 20 years, he took out hundreds of millions of dollars. He's on his way. He's currently serving 50 years in prison for creating a long-term, amazingly simple, but very successful scheme of theft. Lee Farkas, another CEO of a company down here in the South, a realty company that cheated everybody, cheated their bankers, cheated the TARP people, cheated their shareholders, while Mr. Farkas went off with hundreds of millions of dollars for a very lavish lifestyle. He is now serving 20 years in prison. Former CEO of KBR, an international construction company, in jail for 2.5 years for violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. How did he do it? He paid a $180 million bribe to get work for his company in Nigeria. Step 1. Step 2, he took a $10 million kickback from the Nigerian officials. The top of his game, now in prison. Much lower level. This guy was the CEO of a company which he robbed they sold computers. You would recognize the name of his company. But rather than stealing money, he stole inventory and sold it on the black market. A really cheesy self-server, not in jail. Final exhibit in my essay will be this guy, another low-level cheater. He had his company pay for his girlfriend's apartment. He had his company pay for most of his personal expenses. He didn't himself have a credit card. Why? Because he had a corporate credit card. So from the top of the bad behaviors to the cheesiest of the bad behaviors, it isn't hard to find people, CEOs, who have run amok. So how do we explain it? One is simple, and I'm not going to talk about this one at all. They're just greedy. That's an easy and old story. Here's a newer one. Someone who claims to know and have done some science, I have my doubts, but he claims that 4% of all CEOs are psychopaths. Possibly not going to talk about that one today. The third one looks at some recent science on the impact of power or the perception of power on people's risk-taking. I will talk about that. And then I'll finish by talking about some very recent and very interesting science about what happens to people when they engage in combat, whether it be physical combat or financial combat. So let's start with this question of what happens when we acquire power. In several laboratory experiments, psychologists have found that if you think you have power, if you are given signals that lead you to conclude you have power, your willingness to take risks goes up. Now, what's the mechanism that links this perception of power to risk-seeking? It changes the way one thinks. It changes the way one's brain works. It changes the way one prioritizes the signals from the environment. And it actually changes the way in which our brain operates. The psychologists who have worked in this area of power and risk have identified the location where these changes in the brain occur. The nucleus accumbens, deep inside our brain. Now, these are experiments involving undergraduate students that have given rise to this theory about power and risk-taking. Is there anything that we can see in our world, the business world, that suggests there's something to that theory? Not much. But in a recent recap, looking at the companies that made real estate loans during the last decade, researchers found that there was a strong correlation between a perception of power and CEOs who had power as measured by how long they'd been in office, whether they also served as the chair of the board, who else was on their board, what other boards they themselves served on, etc. Those people who had power were far more likely to have engaged in subprime lending than those people who had less power. So we have a little evidence about this theory. But we also know intuitively, I think, if you think about it, that the theory may be missing something. Sometimes when people acquire power, they don't become more risk-seeking. They become much less risk-seeking. They want to maintain the power they've acquired, so they close things down. And we've got laboratory studies that confirm that intuition. But we also have laboratory studies that explain how we might distinguish between those power holders who become more risk-prone and those power holders who don't. And it has to do with the hormone testosterone. And I want you to hold the thought because testosterone plays a very important part in the fourth story that I'm going to tell. There's just a fascinating book that I think it was published in December of 2012. The Hour Between the Dog and Wolf, published by a neuroscientist from Britain. I think it's fascinating. Much of what I have left to say comes from this book. The author is John Coates, who is described as a former Wall Street trader turned Cambridge neuroscientist. And the fact that he is very familiar with markets and very familiar with trading and very familiar with money, but also very familiar with the brain and human and animal behavior becomes important in the story that he tells. There he is, John Coates. Here's the story. Starting with animals, I put the pretty ones up, but it could be wolves, it could be dogs, it could be gorillas, and experiments in the field have demonstrated what I'm about to describe many times in many species of mammals. And that is this. Sooner or later, for territorial reasons, for authority reasons, they're going to engage in combat. And as they recognize, to the degree that they recognize that they're about to get in a fight, mammals' testosterone levels rise in preparation. It's part of the bodily activation that prepares for battle. Now, what happens as the testosterone rises? It not only prepares someone for battle, it makes them better at battle. It makes them more confident that they can win their battle. It gives them resources, physiological resources, to be more effective in battle. Now let's assume our lions have encountered each other and that neither of them has died. They both walk away from the battle. There's a winner and a loser, and they both know which is the winner and which is the loser. Having fought, their testosterone level has already risen, but when the fight is over, the testosterone level of the winner continues to rise. It's kind of a reward for winning. And the combatants walk away. But they may encounter each other again. And the rise in testosterone that occurs because of the battle is retained for some period of time. So the winner may find himself in another battle in which he already has an edge as a result of his elevated testosterone. And if he engages repeatedly in combat, as often happens on the savannah, his body will acquire a highly elevated testosterone level, which for several rounds of combat will enhance his capacity. But that's not the story that Coates is most interested in. He's interested in what happens when the testosterone level gets really high. And it leads to very bad judgment, excessive risk-seeking, and stupid behavior. Often on the savannah, leading to annihilation. Now, why do we care about the lions or the wolves or the dogs and their testosterone? What does all of that have to do with why CEOs run amok? This is where Coates and his background as a trader gets really interesting to me. Because he asks, is it the same in human combat as it is in other mammal combat? And the way he answers the question is not to go to Wall Street because he's now in England, but he goes to the city. He goes to the trading rooms, and he asks the traders if he may test their testosterone before and after combat. In the morning, before they begin their trading, and at the end of their trading day. And they consent, and he does this series of experiments, And not surprisingly, those traders who are successful in a day of combat leave the trading floor with elevated testosterone. And they continue to hold that elevated level of testosterone for a period of time. And if you come back the next day and they had a good day on Monday, they have a good day on Tuesday. Testosterone has a lot to do with how successful they are as traders, and Coates took his inquiry one step further just to make sure he understood the mechanism. And in some laboratory experiments, as with lions, as with wolves, as with dogs, as with traders, when they go into combat with elevated testosterone, they take bigger risks. But as with the lions or with the wolves or with the dogs, there comes a time when their testosterone gets too high and they take too many risks. And we read about traders who themselves run amok. My theory is, as with those traders, as with those lions, we see it, or should see it, in CEOs who have engaged in repeated rounds of combat, particularly repeated rounds of successful combat. Well, that's almost every CEO we can find, because to become a CEO, you have to go through repeated rounds of combat. The tournament that has been described for the way people rise to the top. Now, do we have any evidence at all that this might be true, that there may be a testosterone explosion in the bodies of CEOs? We have, again, very little, but we have one study that I thought was intriguing. They compared CEOs under 45, a time when testosterone is naturally quite high, and CEOs over 45, when testosterone naturally begins to dwindle. And they found that the younger CEOs with the presumably higher testosterone were much more willing and ready to engage in combat. And when they were engaged in combat with their peers, that is, when one young CEO tried to acquire another young CEO, they in fact engaged in a classic form of combat. It wasn't a consensual merger, it was war. So we have a little documentation that there is, or may be, some testosterone effect or winner effect going on with CEOs. And that sometimes CEOs act no differently than the lions on the savannah, with the same ultimate possible effect. Driven by hormones, not subject to cognitive correction. So where does this take us in terms of the agency theory? And my assertion that the agency theory is very much alive and that the agency problem is very much alive. And I guess the punchline would be this: so long as we have this incredibly intense tournament to get to the top of the corporate pyramid, and so long as we have these acquisition battles that we see all the time. I note that Facebook has made 33 acquisitions, and Mark Zuckerberg isn't even 30. So long as we have these two, and we always will have these two features in the corporate world, the agency problem will survive. Not Mark Zuckerberg.
Is that a real picture?
It's a real picture of a cartoon, I think. I hope it's a cartoon. So questions on animal behavior.
The testosterone study, was that done just on men?
It was not. It was done on traders, including women, but in Coates's book, he doesn't break it out. I would like to see that broken out, but there are so few women traders in the city that it was a very small sample.
What do you define as a muck? At what point are you saying that, a CEO run that far? Is it criminal penalties?
No, certainly in the examples that I've used, 3 of them have been sentenced for criminal behavior. 2 of them I deliberately chose because they weren't criminals or hadn't been treated as criminals. I define it pretty broadly to include any of the kinds of behavior that we are concerned about: self-aggrandizement, self-enrichment, disregard of their fiduciary obligations. I'm pretty inclusive in my definition. Doug?
In my book about women CEOs, I examined 22 women CEOs, and I look at the management literature. Jim Collins, good for Able. He says the best model for CEO is to be a plow horse. And they looked at a social psychologist who said the best CEO is a productive narcissist, a show horse rather than a plow horse. But I find in examining the careers of 22 women who made it to the corner suite, 21 fit the pattern of plow horses. Only one, Carlton Fiolina, could arguably be a show horse. So it's different among women. I wonder if that's different testosterone levels. I don't know.
Of course, women do have testosterone, and we have very little data about what that means in terms of their behavior. And I don't know in the animal studies that they find women fighting on the savannah in the way that it's females fighting as they do with males. But there may be a difference in the run-amok story between men and women for that reason. Yes?
So if testosterone is a problem, is there any possible way to link that to policy?
Yeah, don't hire a CEO until he's 75, or only hire women CEOs. I suppose either one of those might be policy prescriptions. Yes, in the back.
There is, it's not about CEOs, but there's a study that Paola Sapienza at Northwestern did with some colleagues, and they swabbed MBA students. And what she did find among women, that even among women, the ones with higher levels of testosterone chose riskier positions subsequent to their MBA. So there is some linkage there that even among women, testosterone levels do result in riskier activities.
One more?
That's terrific. Yeah.
So, I mean, it seems like you're tracking 2 different things. One is testosterone, and the other is we are observing that the winner of a tournament is expected to be problematic, maybe for testosterone reasons, maybe for other reasons. And I wonder whether maybe the normative uptick is can we do away with transformative tournaments to a greater degree? CEO, could we have people slotted in for CEO positions, from early in life or something like that, or you can take it out of the judiciary in America. You've got to be a successful attorney. You fight through years, and then we make you a judge at the end. Maybe that selects for peculiar people you could transform by. If you had a different system where you just slotted people in as a judge, is testosterone or no? Is it possible to think about de-emphasizing tournaments?
Well, as I say, so long as we have tournaments and so long as we have acquisition combat, I think this phenomenon will continue. I'm not sure that I would propose the ends of tournaments because I think they're a pretty meritocratic way of choosing. If there was another way, alphabetically or take a lottery number, we might see something very different than the winner effect.
Just momentarily returning to this question about positive takeaways.
I'm not sure there's anything positive in this story.
Well, it may, and this goes to another of Doug's book, make a case for more diversity on boards of directors. Because even as Ajay said, it shows that testosterone among women produces different results. It certainly could be that having more women on boards of directors would provide a check on what might otherwise be just biological.
Yeah, I have less confidence in board members perhaps than you do, regardless of their gender, but I do think it suggests a need for more vigilance on boards, particularly for people who have gone through an extended tournament process, or particularly amongst people who are engaging in combative behavior, whether in markets or in acquisitions. There may be some triggering events or triggering behaviors that require more vigilance than now occurs. Okay.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Next, my pleasure to introduce Doug Branson, a friend from the time I entered the academy. Doug is now at the University of Pittsburgh, but often visiting. So it's always this great question whenever Doug calls me, where's Doug? Where are you calling from? So Professor Branson has this great, amazing track record of thinking about corporate governance in those terms and in many of its facets since we began focusing on that concept. His 1993 treatise is still one that a lot of us refer to. Oh, and by the way, Venice, the longest-lived, successful human hierarchy, only took doges who were over the age of 70, preferably without any sons. So there's a model for us. Somehow the Venetians knew that. But Doug, I turn things over to you. It's so great to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you, Alan. I want to thank Wake Forest for having me here. Apropos of Jane's talk, one of my favorite sayings is, if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman Sisters, the firm would still be around. I don't know whether that's true, but that's the saying. I'm not going to use PowerPoint. They say power corrupts. PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So I do use it sometimes, but I'm just going to do a doctrinal retrospective of the corporate governance reform proposals that have been floated over the last 50 to 60 years. And fast forwarding, the message is that we get a new proposal about every 5 years, mainly from the elites in the legal education academy, at least the legal academy. And then 5 years later, they turn to a new proposal, and then 5 years they turn to a new proposal. So I'm going to bore you with a retrospective of that, and then we'll ask the question, why is that so? And I think part of it is we continue to define, or let the elites in the academy define the problem in the same terms. The etymology of this talk is I did a book on CEO removals in the 90s, and I tongue-in-cheek joked that reform proposals came forward because people needed to write something to satisfy their deans and to impress their colleagues. And Cornell Press had it peer-reviewed, and it was just a scathing review. A person said that was just terribly cynical, and that the Cornell Press should reject the book. So I kind of put my tail between my legs and moved on to other subjects. And then I was talking to Alan about this symposium, and he was saying, well, one definition of neurosis is that people keep doing the same thing over and over again with the knowledge that it's not doing them any good, or indeed it's harming them. And I thought about that, and I said, that's more than half right, because we just keep floating these proposals, and then 5 years we throw that one out and we start a new one. And in the academy especially, sycophants is too strong a word, but we allow the agenda to be dictated by a dozen or so academics at certain institutions. So I'm going to talk about the problem. The problem has been universally defined as the Burlean means, separation of ownership from control. That with share ownership dispersed, shareholders unable to recombine because of collective action problems, a new form of property has come into being, that the property is not controlled by the people who own it. So what moves into that vacuum? Self-perpetuating managers, greedy managers, directors, and So we've been trying to solve that problem, not we, but the elites have been floating proposals for a long time. Now, my analysis goes back to the nationalization of coal, steel, electrical generating banks in England in the late 40s. Now, I don't think they talked about the separation of ownership from control, but it was in response to a perceived excess of power in corporate hands. And of course, England continued with nationalization until 1971, when most of that was disbanded. Now, I have to research that. I've been a little lazy and I haven't gotten into the library as much as I should, but I did get into the library years ago to look at the works of John Kenneth Galbraith. He was criticized a lot. He was a policy entrepreneur, a wannabe celebrity, which was off the mark because he was a celebrity. And he doesn't use the term separation of ownership from control, but he describes the problem. In his first book, American Capitalism, The Concept of Countervailing Power, he said that the antidote to self-perpetuating managers, greedy managers, was the growth of labor unions, the growth of co-ops, which were popular in the post-war period, especially in the Scandinavian countries. And I wonder, maybe that's where IKEA started. I don't know. And the labor unions. But 2 years later, he wrote a book, The Affluent Society, and he withdrew his support for the concept of countervailing power. And the reason was he thought that once labor unions achieve a certain amount of power, they become aligned with the interests of management, and they seek some of the same things that management seeks. The co-ops never developed. The consumer movements never developed, at least at that time. So he instead posited as a response to the separation of ownership from control problem the concept of the technostructure. The technostructure were the middle-level scientists, accountants, financial people in a corporation who shared more of the values of other people in the community with whom they lived and would act as a check on management or indeed ran companies themselves. The last Galbraith book was Economics and the Public Purpose, and that was shortly before he became ambassador to India, and he gave up. He basically said the solution is some form of nationalization. So those are the first tracings I do of responses to this perceived separation of ownership from control problem. So that's the late 1960s. 65, 67, Economics and the Public Purpose was about 1970. 1970, April, Earth Day, outpouring of teach-ins at campuses across the nation. Pictures of streams with phosphates from excess detergent, care of Procter & Gamble, floating on the surface. It also coincided with the Vietnam War, when people were questioning everything, including authority and the status of anything and everything. So they came forward a number of discrete corporate social responsibility proposals, which advocated government intervention. One was David Ratner, questioning the one share, one vote principle. The idea was there would be graduated voting, and as you obtained more shares, you would get less and less voting power. So it was kind of a power to the people thing. For young people, that was the slogan of the 60s and 70s, which were somewhat good times, actually. But anyway, another proposal was public interest directors. Arthur Goldberg, the former justice of the Supreme Court, resigned from several boards, a very publicized move, and he said, we need directors who have independent staffs and access to information. Of course, the critics pointed out that the Communications Satellite Corporation And the Union Pacific Railroad, after the Credit Mobile scandal, when it was reorganized, had public interest directors. And they were treated as spies and antagonists, and they weren't allowed to participate very much in any decision, and they were denied information. Then there was Don Schwartz at Georgetown. There was campaign GM 1, 2, and 3. Expanded use of the shareholder proxy proposal rule, SEC 14A8. First year that Georgetown students did it, they forgot that you had to own shares. So, but then campaign 2, campaign 3, they did get General Motors to publish. General Motors, which vigorously opposed the inclusion of the proposals, had money to include them, but they responded with a 55-page booklet on GM's record of progress in safety. I wrote one of those pieces. I wrote a 144-page article in the Vanderbilt Law Review on social accounting and disclosure, which oddly enough has been revived in pieces in the Harvard Law Review. But that's 1970 through 1975. The tenor of the proposals are discrete involvement of government in policing the problems created by the separation of ownership from control. The latter half of the 70s, now we have the meta proposals. Federal chartering of corporations and federal minimum standards. Federal chartering was Ralph Nader's project. He wrote a very thick book with Mark Green and Joel Seligman, who's a law professor, who today is the president of the University of Rochester. It was called Constitutionalizing the Corporation. And then there was a popular version press version called Taming the Corporate Tiger. And Nader proposed that corporations above a certain size, originally it was the Fortune 500, it later became the 2,000 largest corporations, and it later included corporations that did any significant amount of business with the federal government, and it later included any corporation whose business was affected with the public interest, and on and on. But there would be a federal chartering organization, agency, and companies would have renewable charters, good for 20 years or 25 years, and the renewal of the charter would be conditioned upon compliance with all federal laws, environmental laws, product safety laws, OSHA, and on and on. It also would contain in the legislation itself certain standards, including anti-concentration standards. The U.S. Congress, under Senator Howard Metzenbaum of Ohio, the parking lot king, actually held hearings for 3 successive Congresses on federal chartering. Maybe it was because of Nader's star power more than a legitimate interest in the proposal. But Professor William Carey, who had taught at Northwestern and then was John Kennedy's head of the SEC and then taught at Columbia, came up with a competing proposal in an article in the Yale Law Journal called The Race to the Bottom. He proposed federal minimum standards. You wouldn't have a federal agency, but if state law were found to be lax on a certain number of indicia, it would be supplanted by federal law, and there would be federal causes of action. Different standards for usurpation of corporate opportunities, for, I can't recall precisely what all, fiduciary duty and the like. So those proposals were very alive in the 70s. I go back a long way, and I'm kind of like the Forrest Gump of corporate governance, so I've seen a lot of stuff. 1980, Ronald Reagan is elected to president. Margaret Thatcher becomes the prime minister. The most pronounced jurisprudential shift I've seen in my lifetime. We went from extensive proposals for federal government intrusion in corporate governance to solve this separation of ownership from control to a jurisprudence that said, is this really a problem at all? I mean, shareholders, rational apathy by shareholders is efficient. That corporate managers are governed better by market forces in the product market, Henry Manny's market for corporate control and the like, than they are bylaws, and lawsuits. An extreme form of the law and economics movement were the contractarians. They were kind of like Unitarians, I think. But they said that the only purpose of corporate law was to provide a set of rules that would approximate the bargain parties to an enterprise would reach absent transaction costs. That fiduciary duty at least should be opted out, be capable of being opted out. Frank Easterbrook, no less, with his Senatarian radio announcer's voice, advocated this openly. The law and economic movement, very valuable movement. I'm a graduate of the Henry Manny course. I take it with a grain of salt, but it taught me a lot. It peaked probably, in my opinion, in the early 90s. There are still some doctrinaire practitioners around. But in about 1985, another proposal emanating from the American Law Institute, which started its restatement of corporate governance in about 1979. I'm a member of the ALI. I attended all of those debates. And the idea was that governance should be a matter of structure and principle, in board comprised of a majority of independent directors, smaller public companies, at least 3 directors who were independent, audit committees, nominating what we call today governance committees, compensation committees, and a restatement of principles of corporate law that had been left to the common law and were not incorporated in statutes. Stanley Kaplan of the University of Chicago was the first reporter. He was vilified. He received death threats. This is the American Law Institute, where when you have the law of donative transfers being discussed, 2/3 of the audience is falling asleep, and the speaker nods off. And these meetings were held at the American Law at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. The ballroom was packed. People were sitting in the aisles. Mel Eisenberg of Berkeley took over from Kaplan, John Coffey of Columbia, Ron Gilson of Stanford, now Columbia, and a practitioner named Marshall Small from Morrison and Forrester in San Francisco were the reporters. The project took 14 years. The American Law Institute, to its credit, allowed House counsel and large law firm lawyers to join in droves. They increased the ceiling on membership. These people monopolized conversation, and it all peaked. I remember when the general counsel of Timken Roller Bearing of Akron, Ohio, took the floor, and he called Roswell Perkins, the patrician partner from Debevoise Plimpton, who was then the president of ALI, called him a liar in front of 1,500 other people. This was ALI with news cameras outside. It was amazing. So that good governance movement and emphasis on structure and general principle then began to rival the law and economics movement, kind of a minimalist jurisprudence. 1990, time for a new proposal. Institutional investor activism. Bernie Black, agents watching agents. And when several of the elite write on a topic, then all of the academics at all the middle level and lesser institutions immediately flock to that subject, and they begin writing about the same subject. Ed Rock at the University of Pennsylvania, though, wrote an article in the Georgetown Law Review about the very certain significance of institutional investor activism. He pointed out that corporate-sponsored pension funds have no interest, and trustees who pursued an agenda of activism in the corporate governance area would last less than 30 days. So the primary proponents of corporate governance and corporate governance proposals would be public employee pension plans and unions pension plans. But even among those, many of the pension plan managers eschew any any agenda other than maximizing return for their members. I mean, I lived in Seattle for many years, and the Washington Public Employees Pension Trust Managers, they did deals with KKR. I mean, they just wanted their target return was, 14, 15%. So institutional investor activism, 1990 to 1995. New proposal, 1995. Global convergence in corporate governance. This is the idea that the world is getting smaller. When the train was invented, the world got 10 times smaller. For 2,000 years before that, it took the same time, roughly, to take a horse from point A to point B. And the train was invented, and the steamship came online, and the world shrunk by a factor of 10. In our era, due to the internet, email, ease of international travel, and the like, the world has shrunk again. 10 times, 12 times, 20 times, I don't know. In corporate governance, people in France know what's occurring in Australia, or they know who to ask. People in Australia know what's going on in Canada, in the UK, and in Germany. And people in Asia, in the People's Republic of China, or in Hong Kong, they are interested in what's happening. I just gave a talk in Hong Kong about Dodd-Frank, about the Jobs Act. They know about it. They're very eager to find out more about it. The world has shrunk. So what's going to happen is we're going to center on one corporate governance model. And nations around the world, newly industrializing nations, will gradually evolve to that model. And of course, how much? 5 minutes. The most arrogant piece I've ever read was The End of History for Corporate Law by a professor at Harvard and a professor at Yale, Hansman. And they said that the convergence will not only exist, and they had debates amongst each other about whether it will be formal convergence or functional convergence, but it will be on, guess what, the American model of corporate governance. Well, I did a series of contracts for the State Department in Indonesia. I was in Australia teaching. This piece and the general governance movement raised a furor around the world. People think Americans are already among the most chauvinistic people on earth, and now they're trying to ram this American model of corporate governance down our throat. Well, within months of Cracklin and Hansman publishing that piece, Enron occurred, WorldCom occurred, Adelphia occurred, and on, corporate governance imbroglios. This was the perfect system of corporate governance? Well, there are a lot of things wrong with it. So, 2000, time for another proposal. The gatekeepers. That's Sarbanes-Oxley. Let's reinvigorate gatekeepers, because independent directors are no longer the force for good in corporate governance that we formerly thought. So we'll put lawyers and accountants in the positions they formerly were or they should have been. So we have whistleblowing in Sarbanes-Oxley. We have a financial expert must be on the audit committee. Number of proposals to strengthen gatekeepers. Where are we now? Well, I don't know. I think I see Lucian Bebchuk, and we're returning to the idea of shareholder activism, say on pay, access to management's proxy proposal for at least shareholders of larger shareholders to nominate directors. But the point is, over 60 years, we just keep doing the same thing over and over again. We're like the neurosis that Alan described to me on the telephone. And why is this? Well, I think, one, we allow the proposals to be from the top down rather than the bottom up. And we allow this very small circle of elites. I go to conferences, Jack Coffey, Gilson, Gordon, they sit by each other. They don't even talk to other people. It's incredible. And they just decide every 5 years, well, this is the new kid on the block, and they write about that proposal, and everybody just like lemmings, they follow along and they start writing and looking into this proposal. Now, I work extensively, I've written several books, several articles on the role of women in corporate governance, and that's a bottom-up proposal, at least to me. It's been around for 15, 18 years. It's gathered momentum very slowly. A lot of people are interested in it, very interested in it in Hong Kong when I was there 2 weeks ago. And it is a proposal from the bottom up. None of the elites have shown any interest. Maybe they're all male chauvinists. I suspect that they are. I'll be frank. But, and the other thing I think is we just we don't redefine the problem, which is the task we're about today. I mean, we still are like a broken record. It's the separation of ownership from control, the vacuum so created, and how do we substitute for active other regarding managers and directors. So that's what we're about today, I think, about redefining the problem or the question of whether it should be redefined. So that may have bored you, but that's my Forrest Gump retrospective of corporate governance reform proposals.
Let's take about 5 minutes. 5 minutes for questions.
Ken?
Yeah, I am very sympathetic to this kind of view that we have a little bit of history repeating itself. I guess I would even go further and say it's almost like there's an imaginary storeroom with some of these things that you're right. There's sort of a periodic, taking of things off the shelf. And so, like I said, I'm very sympathetic to the story. I think a lot of times when that happens is there's a triggering event, and it's oftentimes scandal is the thing, and going and taking something off the shelf of these kind of nice prepackaged academic theories becomes easy. I'm sort of curious as to your opinion. I think you could further divide some of these theories into kind of left and right, if you will, in terms of their nature. And the proposal, if you have a sense of if you think one side or the other has been better off as we have the repetition of sort of new reform cycles and new ideas that may be sort of similar to the past, in terms of which side is more successful in getting theirs through.
Well, I think law and economics is the most conservative, on the right, if you will, jurisprudence. It's a very valuable jurisprudence. But to me, it peaked in the early 90s, mid-90s. It's often talked about the contractarians versus the constitutionalists. Constitutionalists would believe that fiduciary duty is an irreducible core or minimum to corporate law, and that there are certain principles that should be non-waivable, that can't be opted out, and that corporate law does have a function to play. I think those people won that fight. I mean, I think that was a competition between ideas, and I think the constitutionalists, by and large, won. But there are some people, John Macy, the late Larry Ribstein, boy, if you did, they were they're doctrinaire law and economics, and if you disagreed with them, they just turn and walk away from you. They just so they don't believe the fight is over. So I just think this is the most stratified area in academic law. Every area I know of, and I have colleagues in, become very egalitarian. But in this area, corporate securities, there are about a dozen people that control the top. And I'm more cynical than you are. I just think that I think that they must talk to each other and say, well, it's time to come up with a new proposal. So, Jane?
They handed me a mic. Your cliffhanger was so interesting to me. You said, well, we're here to see if we can...
What was so interesting?
Your cliffhanger, your last punchline, when you said, we're here to see if maybe we can redefine the problem. It may not be the difference between ownership and control. Do you have a different problem that you want us to explore?
No, I view my function as serving up slow pitches for the rest of it. I mean, I don't think I'm going to win the Nobel Prize. I don't really have any solution.
I just was thinking after I talked with Alan, and you know, I just thought about his definition of neurosis is correct, and so I set out to demonstrate that.
Is that a good transition?
Thank you.
Thank you.
So there will be a changing of the guard as students run to class and another group filters in. So the keeping with the humility sort of theme of Wake Forest, we put our speakers into a corner and darken it. And you hear a voice sort of emanating, but it's... at some point, we're going to have an upgrade in the building. We'll have a shining light on those of you who, those of us who take on the podium. But my colleague friend at Vanderbilt, Randall Thomas, was listening to me expound on this idea that agency theory is questionable. Randall doesn't believe that at all. He's made a career, and he will continue to make his career measuring and testing agency theory concepts. And I've joined with him. We've done some say-on-pay articles, and we have a big database on voting by shareholders. But Randall said, but you should read Jopp Winter, and I had not heard your name until Randall mentioned it. And I read right away such a provocative article on the question of whether executive compensation is producing perverse results, doing exactly the opposite in terms of how it makes executives view their role in a business, that I thought to myself, one, I should organize a conference around Jopp Winter, and two, that this is something that so resonated with me, and I'm so thankful that you came here to be here in person to talk about your thoughts on agency theory and corporate governance. Jopp is at the University of Amsterdam, and I had seen your picture, and I had forgotten that everybody in Amsterdam is 6'4" or taller. And so it's great to have your presence here as well.
Thank you very much, Alan. I think it is very good to have somebody from the Netherlands speak about corporate governance and agency theory, because we should take the history much further back than just the last 60 years or so. The agency theory, not pronounced like that, but the problem at least, was already clear from the first days of the first listed company anywhere in the world, which was a Dutch company called the East Indies Company, which was set up to organize trips to go to the East Indies to buy spices, bring them back to Europe, start to sell them, and create a handsome profit for those who did it. That company was set up in 1602. And the shares in the company were traded in the stock exchange of Amsterdam, which was simply a set of what you would now call coffee shops in Amsterdam. That was the trading floor. For the first 10 years, the company did not pay any dividends, and it did not produce any annual account, any some form of report or account for what it had actually produced. We had the first shareholder activist in 1609, Mr. Lemaire, who sent a public letter to what then was called a type of newspaper, claiming and complaining about the directors of that company withholding information to its investors, on the basis of which nobody could actually decide for what value to sell or buy their shares. They had no idea what the value of the company was. They were not given any information. They have fought for about 14 years about how to change this. And by the way, this was in the times of renewable charters. The company was chartered for 20 years by the Dutch government and had to be renewed and constantly renewed. In 1621 only, they agreed on a level of corporate governance measures, as we would call them now, some level of transparency. Annual accounts had to be produced and published. And the shareholders were given a position in a separate board, not in the board of directors, but in a separate board, which we now in our Dutch system call a supervisory board, in a two-tier model, who could overview the books of the company when they were actually used to produce annual accounts. What they found was that the directors of the company had constantly, on every trip that any ship made from the East Indies back to the Netherlands, sold spices in harbors along the way for their private profit, with the money of the shareholders. This is Enron 400 years before Enron. Nothing has changed. In that sense, the agency theory did not start when Mike first really described it in a way. The problem of principal and agents is the problem that we have with separation of ownership and control. It's basically what it is, and it's old. Now, if you look at the situation of today, if you look at the three key players in the governance triangle, as I would look at it, shareholders, executives, and non-executives, at least inside the company, they all have their own difficulties. Shareholders don't do what under activist or whatever agenda, corporate governance agenda, we think they should be doing, having a meaningful role in the corporate governance of any corporation. Executives, the key problem, and we'll have another panel later on this morning about executive remuneration. Basically, an attempt to align the interests of executives with those of their principals, the shareholders. But what we now see, and that's the paper that you refer to, Alan, actually we can't handle it. The excessiveness and the large scale of variable pay is something people can't deal with on a number of elements of their score. It's very, I'm actually absolutely excited to be able to say this finally also in the United States. You are absolutely wrong, and let me say it nicely, black and white, as a Dutchman would typically do. You are wrong thinking that massive variable pay is actually going to help the performance of the company. It is not happening for a number of set of reasons. And finally, the non-executives, at least inside the company, the people who sit on companies' boards, they should be monitors, looking at these executives as the agents. They should monitor them, and somehow we find out through also the scandals over the last 10 years or so, they're actually not doing it. If you look at the journalistic accounts of Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns, and we had another almost collapse in the Netherlands, ABN AMRO Bank, a large Dutch bank, who was finally acquired by other banks who then went bankrupt in the financial crisis because of their acquisition, so that's big-time failure. If you look at the accounts of those banks in these books, you hardly read anything about the board and the non-executives. And when you read something about them, they seem to be in the way of rational decision-taking. Not helping it, but somehow actually obstructing in some form or shape. They're not doing what we think they should be doing. Now the key question for me is, in all of these dimensions, is agency theory good enough to help us understand what is really going on? It indicates what the problems are, clearly. And those problems, as I said, have existed for 400 years and they will continue to exist. But does it give us really the level of understanding that we need to have in order to find the ways to deal with it? And I'm explicitly not using the word solve it, but because I'm not sure that we can actually solve it definitely. But we can at least deal with it probably in a better way. And we need a different type of understanding that allows to look at different type of solutions. The key problem that I have with the way that we have dealt with the understandings or the insights that we thought agency theory would give us is in a very mechanical, intellectual way, by creating, as Doug said, filling up the vacuum with other people who should control, gatekeepers or other systems, those giving power to others, having more transparency. Those are all the things that you can dream up intellectually if you only think that maximizing human value for yourself is the key driver in all of this. And we have to find type of solutions that you can imagine. And whether it's the elite, just the 12 people who do it, many people in Europe would believe that I'm part of the elite in Europe, that group of 12 people. The good thing of Europe is that it constantly is ignoring what that elite is saying. Maybe that's one of the great things about Europe. It works slightly differently than here, perhaps. But the way that we look at these problems is very mechanically, and it is avoiding the key thing that we should be talking about, and we have never done so. And that is, for me at least, what it is to be human. And there are many different perspectives about this. The neurological perspective, the psychological perspective, and a new type of perspective that Mike Jensen will talk about later on today, which in combination perhaps will give us a much better understanding of what actually is happening and what we can do about that. One thing, and this is typical, this is important for us as lawyers to understand, because if we don't understand it, nobody else will. The one thing we constantly do when we perceive problems, whether it's in corporate governance or any other part of human life, we constantly seek for some form of regulation to deal with the problem. We see people behave irresponsibly, and what we do, we make rules to make sure they can't behave irresponsibly anymore, in different forms and shapes. And there's a fundamental problem with that. What we know, and actually we know this from Aristotle 2,300 years ago, that rules will not make people more responsible. Actually, they will make people less responsible. What people do in an environment which is more and more infused with regulation is to reduce their responsibility for the effects of their behavior towards others, with a responsibility to comply with those rules, which is a much lesser, poorer level of responsibility. And if it then doesn't work, you comply with the rules, but still your behavior is bad. And what we've seen in all the arguments after the financial crisis, the Goldman Sachs Abacus scheme, when they were sued or challenged by the SEC about this, that they should never have invited investors to invest in this vehicle, knowing that a hedge fund manager betted heavily against all the assets that were included in the fund. The first response of Goldman Sachs was, we did nothing illegal. The problem is that isn't good enough. And that is precisely the mindset that we have if we create an environment which is more and more becoming legal. We only think that it is our responsibility to behave within the rules of the law. But that still caters and offers so much opportunity for bad behavior that we no longer feel responsible for. And if people then start to complain about our behavior, we start to say, well, it's a problem of the law. The law isn't good enough. We need more rules or better rules, or we need better enforcement, different people at the SEC, you name it. Barry Schwartz said very clearly, more and more rules destroy our moral skills. We start to become automatons who digitally simply follow the rules and don't ask ourselves further questions about what we are supposed to be doing in this role. You name it, CEO or chairman or non-executive, whatever the role is. We simply follow the rules, which does not require much thinking, and certainly not anymore about the effect of our behavior. And some insight we should have, and actually that I borrow from The Economist, rules and institutions have also diminishing marginal utility. There is a level of value in rules up to a certain level, and if we then pound more and more rules on top of that, the additional value, the marginal value, is coming down. And it's probably going to destroy the way that people behave in that environment rather than stimulate responsibility. So I'm very much hesitant about every new proposal, regardless of who actually makes it, to deal with the underlying problems through regulation. We should be very hesitant. For shareholders, and I won't spend much time on it, actually not at all, they're not doing what we think they should be doing in this story about activist institutional investors. Why are they not actually grabbing a role to discipline management in corporate governance? This will never change as long as the predominant view in the investment community is that diversification and constant liquidity is absolutely needed in order to make a decent investment return. As long as people believe this to be the only way that you can invest in the market, they will never have sufficient incentive to start to really discipline, because it will never pay off. Rational empathy. That's why you do it. What could change this if some people would go against this trend? Because this is also a story. We have imagined that you can only do it in this way, and we've come up with all sorts of mathematical forms of evidence and betas and alphas to support the idea that you can only do this in this way if you diversify and have constant liquidity. Others show it's not true. There was a story in the FT yesterday, the Financial Times, about Investor, who together with another large company holds about 40% of listed companies in Sweden, as a large controlling shareholder, taking 25 to 40% of shares and having been there for 60, 70 years, and the returns of that company and the Swedish companies over the years actually exceed the market in general. Maybe that's a model. Maybe we can learn from private equity how they do it in a very different time frame model, and how they use the sort of skills to really understand the companies they're investing in. Investors today don't understand companies, they understand investment at best. And as long as that stays, shareholders will not pick up a meaningful role in corporate governance. We should forget that. Executive remuneration, and again the next panel will talk about that more extensively. The paper that I wrote is most of what we have done in this field so far is dealing with design and governance problems. Mike Jensen, you yourself wrote about this. Lucian Babchuk has been very active in this field, pointing at all the design and governance problems with executive remuneration. But the problem is much deeper. The problem is indeed, if you look at psychological research, that we can't handle that type of incentive. It crowds out our own intrinsic motivation. People get addicted to large variable pay, and if you want to take it away, they will start to think, why am I still working hard? You're no longer paying me for it. Well, actually, working hard was what I expected you would do anyway, because you are the CEO of this company. You have that responsibility. You're not working hard just for your bonus. But if you remove the bonus, that is what's happening. And it constantly happens. If we allow our system to constantly be dominated by preset targets, we ask executives to lie twice. Another paper of Mike about budgeting, and if you combine that with targets for variable pay, this is what you get. They should be lying about how stretching the targets are when they start, and then they start to lie at the end whether the targets had been met and how they got there. And this is what we see in practice. And what I like about Mike's paper on this point, this is not just the crooks that Eugene wrote about and talked about. Everybody's doing it. We're all doing this. Everybody who lives in corporate life and has to explain his budget to his boss at a higher level is playing this game. It's a constant game that we're constantly playing, and it creates what Dan Ariely calls the fudge factor. We are willing to cut corners and cheat a little if we have a feeling we can get away with it, and it's not that big, it doesn't have such a huge impact. So just tweak the numbers with a few percent, that's okay. You can still go home and feel good about yourself. That's what Ariely calls the fudge factor. The problem is, if we constantly do it, fudge factor culture creates an enormous atmosphere and a breeding ground for real fraudulent behavior, because it is accepted to constantly tweak the numbers with a few percent, and then we'll do this. The panel later on, you will talk about the benchmarking effect, the upward spiraling effect of benchmarking without any reasonable relation to performance. The understanding that variable pay has anything to do with performance of the directors themselves, or let alone with performance of the company, is simply not working anymore. It's not true. If I challenge executives in Europe about this, they first always would say, well, we need this system in order to incentivize people to do the right thing. Then I come up with all these problems, and they start to talk for themselves. Yes, but I have never noticed any measurable effect, any substantial effect of variable pay on my performance. So I ask them, then why do you get it? If it doesn't make sense, if it doesn't move your behavior in any direction, why do we do this? And then they say, this is the remaining argument, at least in Europe, has nothing to do with agency anymore and with alignment of interest of executives with the shareholders. They say it is about flexibility of labor cost. Because if we perform worse Variable pay makes sure that we get paid less. And that's good for shareholders. But it has nothing to do, if you challenge them with this criticism, they step away to the next justification for having it by saying actually it makes it cheaper for shareholders when we don't perform. It doesn't incentivize me. That doesn't work, apparently, and it doesn't. If we want to solve this, we have to look at completely different ways of the things that really move and transform people. And there's a combination of factors: autonomy, mastery, and purpose beyond yourself, that do the trick. If people feel that combination, they're autonomous in their work, they have the patience and are allowed to become masters, to get better at what they do over time, to see and understand more, and they're doing it for a purpose which is beyond themselves, they fly. That's what they do. You don't need variable pay for that. Actually, variable pay is destroying most of that. It is not about what you do for the good of that company and what the company can do for society. It is about what you get out of it. It is not patiently growing and getting better over time. It's about what you get out of it now. And it's not about autonomy. It's actually a controlling system. You only get paid if you deliver this. So it's not actually supporting autonomy. The real indicators about what this is doing with us is that they're actually indicating we can't handle it. And we should change that. Now for the non-executives and the board stuff. We're regulating boards now. As you said, Doug, as a response to Sarbanes or to the Enron type of crisis, we're focusing on boards and external gatekeepers, but certainly still also on the non-executives. We want them to be independent, expert, and diversity is certainly something that's coming up in Europe. My country, in the Netherlands, we have a new law which says that 30% of executives and of non-executives should be of both sexes in each board. In Norway, it's 40%, and it's mandatory in Norway. If you don't make that, your company is dissolved by force of law. At EU level, they are working at a directive to put up something similar like that, whether they're negotiating 30 or 40%, and whether it should be hard law, mandatory, and you can't escape, or comply or explain type of regulation. But it's happening in Europe, absolutely. If you look at the research which tries to compare those measures with firm performance, actually you see very little. There is no clear relation between any of these. Expertise a little bit, but independence, very mixed results. We just had a thesis, PhD thesis defended in the Netherlands, Van Zijl, who looked at all the papers about independence from the 1990s until last year. The result is mixed, and it's sometimes actually, depending on the way you look, it's actually negative. Diversity, mixed results as well. McKinsey claims there are positive correlations, but can't explain the error of causation. Is it that good companies love to have more women on boards? Or is more women on boards actually making these companies better? We don't know that yet. But there's something in it. At least it sparks our imagination. What all of this research is not doing, and I think this is crucial, it is not doing anything to understand what boards are really doing. They look at input variables, and they compare with firm performance, and they try to correlate and explain that correlation. But how that process actually works, what's going on in the board, escapes this type of research. And that's a fundamental flaw, because what happens in the middle, if you just look at the board activity, is human interaction. It's about us, the way we do things, which are not explained by statistical regressions. It's how we do things together when we sit on the board. How do we crack this? How can we look into the board? And as an academic, you're not there at the board meeting, but how can you still find ways to get access? I do a lot of board reviews. I review non-executives in their performance with executives. I interview them, and we're developing tools to get a much better insight into what actually is happening within the boardroom. And we use that also to start up academic research with those findings. and see if we can correlate what we find here with what we see, for example, in Malaysia, where we're also doing some of that research. What is clear, for me at least, in this field, there are two key problems. One is role unclarity between non-executives and executives. And the second is the much more fundamental one: how to authorize yourself in the role of a non-executive to actually be a non-executive. Not just do some things, but to be it. And that's a tough one. And I'll very quickly show you a few things that we've seen. Role unclarity. Jay Loyce wrote a book last year interviewing US non-executives. The key finding there is what they're struggling with most is not knowing what their role actually is. The law doesn't really say it. You're on the board of directors, you're independent, and then what? How to do this, what to do precisely, what to expect of executives in that interaction. The law does not give you any guidance. European corporate governance codes don't give you much guidance either. They go a little bit deeper than the level of legislation in the US, but on the fundamentals, how to do this, and what for and what precisely, and when do you feel on task in the sense you're doing the right things and you're doing them in the right way, the law will never tell you. It's unclear. What is also clear from the way that we get information out of board reviews is that our focus in regulation on the role of non-executives is very one-dimensional. We need to focus very much and much more on the role of executives, in particular in the dynamics between the two. Anybody who sits on boards, and I'm on the board of a large multinational company in the Netherlands, knows that executives can make or break any functioning of the non-executives. If the executives don't want to give any information or any relevant information, non-executives will never have it. What we should be looking at is to try to understand the dynamics between the two, the groups of non-executives versus either the CEO in a much more American system or in the larger group of executives that you more often see in Europe. And that's a tough one. One thing we have developed is what we call organizational role analysis. This is a theory from management and organization. What we typically see if people look at organizations and something doesn't work well, we look either at the organization and we start to dream up different structurings in the organization, different hierarchies, the reporting lines, etc. We go to a management consultant. Or there's something wrong with the person who needs a therapist or at least a coach. In real life, the way that a person is connected to the organization is through his role. And that's where the trouble starts. And this has everything to do with the way our brain works and the way we perceive reality. Our role is typically defined in formal documents. The role as a non-executive in articles of association, in legislation, in regulations of the board, and you name it. Formal role definitions. But what people take out of all these formal role definitions are very personal role ideas. Their own story about what that role actually means for them. Now those role ideas are never the same. Because we never develop exactly the same stories when we look at exactly the same events. And we know this from witness problems in accidents. If you ask 5 people what was the accident like, some saw a red car, the other saw a blue car, the other saw a car which was speeding, the fourth one saw a car which was actually not speeding, etc., etc. We see different things visually, and certainly also our creation of images about the roles that we should perform are very different. What we see in boards is that we never talk about those role ideas. But people have different ideas that push them to behave in different ways. But they don't know how to talk about that. So they start to disagree on the substance of what they need to discuss in big investment and acquisition. Or how to look at the strategy or the current performance. That is what actually the discussion is about. They start to fight and have conflicts about that, while the underlying problem is their ideas about roles which are not aligned. We use this matrix, and I won't explain it in light of time, to start to talk with people what their role actually could be in these fields of hygiene, internal control, financial statements, etc., strategy, performance, the role of employer that non-executives have towards executives, and stakeholders, shareholders, and the levels of intensity of the involvement of the non-executives, and what that requires from non-executives and from executives to make that happen, to understand it in the same way, and to actually start to behave in ways that facilitate that role and that intensity in this field. We look at boards and the question on whether they're on task and doing what they're supposed to be doing, not just from the system point of view. We also look at group dynamics and the persons who sit around the table and the way they are and behave, actually. One thing we've developed is a very strange or new type of questionnaire. We call it board reality questionnaire, to understand what has really occurred over the last year or so in the board that you're a non-executive or an executive of. And I'll show you, and again I won't explain, it's way too complicated, but just to show you what is seen. This slide is taken from a report that I'm going to give Monday evening back in Amsterdam to a board. The first 3 columns on the right are indicating the levels of alignment or disalignment between, in the first column, the non-executives on the board, the second column, the executives, and the third group is a group of people who is not on the board but who can witness the board dynamics. If it's green, they are aligned, they have the same feeling about gave the same answers of what has occurred relating to each of these questions. If it's red, they are disaligned. There are different views about what actually happened. In the column 4 and 5, we have compared the answers of the executives and the answers of non-board members to the answers that the non-executives gave. If it's green, they gave the same answers. If it's red, orange, or purple, they have completely different answers. If they are purple, it actually means the executives gave contrasting answers to what the non-executives thought was happening. The executives take something, the last 3 questions, 36, 37, 38, the executives give very different answers than the non-executives give. For example, about the type of information that was discussed and was provided to non-executive directors, executives think they give everything, and non-executives don't have that feeling. If you ask this to people in interviews, they will never say this, because their sense of having to give politically correct answers is so strong that very often they're hesitant to share that with you. If they can write it down like this anonymously, then you get this picture. On this, and we have about 150 questions or so, this is just one of the dimensions, and you see quite a bit of disalignment and actually contrasting views that executives have with non-executives. That raises a big question for this board on this dimension about information, how they're actually dealing with it. They don't know from each other, they have different views, and in all likelihood never discussed it. I'm wrapping up. Then it comes, if we get more clarity on the roles, and this sort of tools may help us to get there. Still the big question is, if you know what your role is, how are you going to do it? When or under what circumstances will you do it? And one of the things that I have, I worry about in the way that we talk about those people who've made mistakes, is that we constantly create the impression that these are bad people, very different from us. While in reality, most of the people who sit on boards and let it happen are as qualified or sometimes more qualified than we are. They're not worse people. They're not people with less integrity. They're not more coward than we are. Only they were there and we were not. When I introduced Mike in October 2008 to speak in Amsterdam, in the building of ABN AMRO, which was just nationalized 2 weeks before, to give your speech about similar subjects that you will talk about this afternoon. I asked the audience, who of you can say that you would have done a much better job would you have been on the board of this bank? Nobody raised their hand, of course, but I believe some people actually believe that would not have happened if they would have been there. And I don't think it's true. The challenge for each of us all the time is, even if you know the roles and have the clarity, what is needed for me to do it? What makes me be a non-executive director who's responsible in its role? Being that non-executive. And you just need one justification not to do it. One story that you can keep up for yourself why you do not have to step in that role. Like, this is what the chairman should be doing. Or others don't do it either. I'm not being paid for this. All of that is enough to not do it. And the key question is how to overcome that. Not with regulatory tools and more rules, and not with more incentives, but how to get to us inside much more closely to understand what it is that we can do. And I'll share one, and I'll take 1.5 minute from your time now, Alan, to show them how philosophers and artists know this already. Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, Benjamin Franklin, Michel Foucault, Peter Sloterdijk, a German philosopher in these days, all know things about how rules don't work. How actually finding a mean between two opposites, Aristotle, and trying to practice with that over time makes us more virtuous. Peter Sloterdijk, the German, calls this anthropotechnique. Life is about practicing. And the only reason why you should start practicing is because when you realize that your life is about you. And that's this image of this torso of Apollo, about whom the German poet Rilke wrote an extraordinary poem, of which the last two lines are these. And the last two, the whole poem is about what you see when you look at this torso. The head is gone, but you can still see him smile. Smile from a basis of perfection. That's the way sort of words that Rilke uses about this torso. And then suddenly, in the last two lines, the poem changes completely. There is no place here in this torso that doesn't see you. Denn da ist keine Stelle, die dich nicht sieht. There's no place here that does not see you. You were thinking you were watching something, but it's watching at you. You have to change your life. Du musst dein Leben ändern. That's the key thing. When you realize, when you watch all of that, of which you're part or not part, and we have all ideas about how it should be better, but only when you start to realize this is about you, what you could be in order to make a difference. If we could do that in boardrooms, we'd have much better board dynamics. Thank you.
Hope you don't mind. I'm going to make an executive decision. And it is that I think you've answered questions. And my role is to abide by the schedule that Will and Taryn have enforced on me. So let's have a 5-minute break rather than a 10-minute break. And can we come back in 5 minutes?